Burnett.
Okay, so this is Heidi Muyeso-Kunzman. I'm with the Community and Regional Development Institute at Cornell and also a member of the E-Extension Enhancing Rural Community Capacity Community of Practice. And on behalf of the whole Community of Practice, we're very pleased that you've joined us today for Deborah Hanson and Lori Higgins' presentation on using ripple effects mapping to determine your program outcomes. Before I turn the mic over to Deb and Lori, I just want to share a little bit about the COP. So we're a team of extension professionals from across the United States who conduct research, develop educational resources, and facilitate the community development process to build and strengthen the capacity of people in rural communities and regions to identify, pursue, and achieve their shared goals. We've developed the webinar series both to support each other and our community and economic development partners across the country. We hope you will find this one valuable and that you'll join us for future webinars. We plan on having about 2 or 3 each semester and one over the summer. And they'll typically be held on Tuesday afternoons. So our plan is to cover an array of community and economic development topics, and if you have one that A, you'd like to share, or B, that you think would be helpful to others in the community and economic development arena, please let us know. We welcome your suggestions, and we will be sharing a recording of this presentation and information about other upcoming webinars on our E-Extension or extension.org website, and you can find Enhancing Rural Community Capacity there among the other communities of practice. Information about the webinars are in our virtual learning center. I just want to point out that on your screen you should see a series of icons which include a chat box. If you don't and haven't already opened them up, you'll see a chat box and a participant list. So if you'd like to see who else is on and communicate with us via chat to share any questions, we encourage you to do that. You can, when you type a message into the chat box, you can send it either to a host, to the presenters altogether, or to everyone. And we encourage you to do it to everyone. We think we all benefit from our feedback and questions. But if you have any questions that you want to just direct to someone privately, please feel free to do that as well. Let's see. Oh, another thing to just let you know about is that following the webinar, you will automatically be directed to an evaluation of the webinar. It's just a 3-question, very quick pop-up evaluation, and at the end of that, there's a link back to our website where you can see an article that Deborah and Lori just published regarding this topic, and we will also be posting other articles related to using ripple effect mapping. And also just the recording of the webinar, again, will be in that section. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Deb and Lori with many thanks for them to put this on for us. We're excited to see all the presentation.
Thanks, Heidi.
You're welcome.
So I'm Lori Higgins with University of Idaho Extension, and I've been working in Extension now for about 13, 14 years doing community economic development as an Extension specialist. And my focus areas are entrepreneurship and leadership development. I do community assessments, and I really love ripple effects mapping.
And I am Deborah Hanson, and I am a county-based director for a rural community north of Spokane called Stevens County. And I've also been with Extension for about 15 years. And my program area is community and economic development and focusing on agriculture in our communities. And like Lori, I want to be very clear that my bias is that I love ripple effects mapping. I've been doing it for about 5 or 6 years. I want to tell the story about how I came up with the idea, and there are other people that started it around the same time. So it's a very emerging kind of project that we all love. I was involved in a program called Horizons, which is a community leadership program, and had 9 communities in my county engaged in an 18-month project that had all kinds of starts and stops and people being involved. And about 6 months after the project ended, I ran into one of the participants, and he mentioned something that happened because he went through Horizons. And it was, I just stood there and thought I would never capture that story with the evaluations that we did on the program. So kind of came up with this idea of using mind mapping because I use that for planning. And then ripple effects mapping emerged from that. And we've been working with teams across many states to bring you different versions of the tool. So Lori and I use one tool that we'll share. But Scott Chasden in Minnesota, Lynette Flage in North Dakota, and Mary Emery at South Dakota all do different versions of it, and it's all very exciting. I use it with communities and nonprofit groups for evaluating their work. So it doesn't have to be just about community development, and we'll share examples of ways that you can use it for your work. So like I said, I love doing it, I love talking about it, and good for you today that I love teaching others how to do it. So let's get started. So I'm going to do a little bit of speed dating at the beginning because I want to tell you about the background, the theory, the benefits, how and why to use it, and some of the basic elements. But to understand all of that, I think you also need to see it in action. And Lori then is going to pick it up, and she is actually going to start letting you get to know REM. So you do speed dating to find out if you want to get to know somebody, and then you get to finding out if it's something that's going to work for you. So Lori, can you advance to the next slide? Okay, so she's going to talk about the process, give you a demonstration, talk briefly about how to use the data and code it, and then I'm going to come back and share with you some of the limitations and suggestions because it is an emerging tool and it's qualitative, so there are some things that you need to watch out for, or at least think about. Okay, so let's talk about the purpose. Why do you want to use ripple effects mapping? So this tool helps you find out the intended and the unintended results of a program for the individuals in the program, the group, or community. It is a very effective way to get information and stories out of your brain onto a piece of paper so that you can capture those compelling stories, connect them together, and discover some of your impact. I think the unintended part is a kind of unique attribution of this particular tool. So the benefits are that it does give you an effective process for reflection. We reflect about our work a lot, especially in universities and extension, because we're doing reports and evaluations. But it's not always that community partners and the people that participate can really reflect on the work that is done and celebrate the things that they have done. It captures complex and evolving work. An evaluation at the end of a program, a written evaluation, online evaluation, does not actually talk about the interconnectedness of the work that's happening in our communities and in our groups. It's very participatory. It uses an appreciative approach, so it's positive, it's exciting, and it absolutely engages stakeholders. I will say that this is the only and first evaluation tool that I like to use and that the participants also like to use. They walk out of the room going, wow, that was fun, and let's do it again. It also allows us to, as a group, validate the results. When you're doing an individual survey, sometimes you don't know if they're telling the whole story or if there are other pieces to it. So this particular process allows someone to tell a story and others to add information or validation to it. So it's a great way to pull more information together and connect it. And every time I've done it, someone walks out with an aha of the work that they've done or the things that they want to do in the future. So it's very helpful in identifying and evaluating complex community programs like I mentioned. So when we think about doing work in communities, it often builds social capital and community capital and some of those other capitals, but it's very difficult to attach credit to a complex problem or a complex project. So this project lets people see how an investment in social capital or human capital, even the smallest steps can lead to larger successes in all areas. So starting out with the things that build that social capital are the ones that create the larger capitals in the future. And that future is very difficult to quantify sometimes because those things in the larger context happen after months or even years. So having it do an event that's, or evaluating an event that's happened before is one of the benefits of ripple effect mapping. So you can do this particular tool in a post-program way at the end of a project, which can provide closure for the participants in the program. It can provide celebration. It can provide you information for reporting for stakeholders or funders. You can also do this ripple effects mapping midstream or in a mid-project. That does help you celebrate things that have happened to date. It does give you an awareness of things that are working and places that there are gaps, which does allow you to do some more strategic planning about moving forward. So it can be used midstream, it can be used at the end of a project. Very beneficial. So why does it work? One of the things that we really have fine-tuned with our kind of group efforts at this is that we use 3 different kinds of theories to make this happen. We use appreciative inquiry interviews, we use mind mapping as the visual tool, and then we drive towards identifying the community capitals framework that makes it all make sense. We are not in this webinar going to dive very deep into the theory of appreciative inquiry, mind mapping, or community capitals. But at the end of the website, at the end of the webinar, we have a website link that has a lot of tools and articles that help kind of explain appreciative inquiry, help explain community capitals and how it might work for here. We're just going to demonstrate how we use these tools, and then you may need to do some more research or reading about how the actual theories kind of work. So appreciative inquiry, though, for this particular project, it allows people to reflect about their stories. It primes the pump for doing the mind mapping on the wall, and it is a way for quiet people in the group to participate. It's not just the loud, boisterous ones or the ones with the biggest voices in the room. Once we do the appreciative inquiry interviews, the mind mapping is where it starts to get creative, engaging, and interactive. And when Lori shows you about how that works, you'll see that it's not just a singular activity, it's a group activity. And then using the community capitals framework helps them to think about the whole community and how they impact it. And again, thinking about what those small early steps do to impact the larger community capitals framework and changes in their communities. So we've used this ripple effect mapping in several different ways. It can be used for leadership programs, community development, tourism, business retention, youth development. One of the things I think that is so valuable about this tool is you can get a group of people that have a wide variety of skills, abilities, and ages, and everybody participates. So it's not something that you have to have a certain amount of education for or a certain amount of knowledge. Your story about your participation in the project is just as valuable and interesting to report as anybody else's. So it's very, very engaging for all. We've got some work that's coming up on working with an arts group that's combining 3 arts groups together, and how are they going to celebrate their past and move into the future. We are hoping to work with some food coalitions and talk about how does the policy work that they do have an impact on communities and regions. So very exciting work about future applications. Like I said in the beginning, there are some emerging differences about how to use ripple effects mapping. And on the website, there is an article that's primary author is Mary Emery, and talks about these 3 different approaches. And we've kind of named them at the top. They all use those 3 theories of appreciative inquiry, mind mapping, and community capitals framework, but we kind of get at the information just a little bit different. We're not going to talk about Scott Chasden's or Mary Emery's methods. There's lots of information on the website for you to dive into that and see if that's the right tool for you to use. Lori and I today are going to talk about our method and why we find it useful for the work that we do and how it comes together and why we think it's advantageous for what we do. So let me give you a framework of the process. So first off, you have to identify an intervention or a program that you want to evaluate. So that's your first job. Obviously that you're thinking about some because you're on the webinar and thinking there might be some way that you'd use this tool. Once you decide on the program, the first thing you'll do is schedule an event and invite participation. So the event, the mapping event itself, takes about 1.5 to 2 hours. That gives you adequate enough time to have the interviews, reflect, and then map and have discussions about the process. You hold a group mapping session, and a group is around 10 to 15 people. If you imagine a lot of people in a group telling stories, you can't have 50 people in a room and all tell stories. So we've found that 10 to 15 people is a good size. If there are more people you want involved, then you're going to have to think about, do we hold several sessions or do we make it a longer event? There's lots of flexibility, but these are some of the things that we've found. There is a part where you might need to do some follow-up interviews, and again, Lori will show you where that would be applicable or why you might need to do that. And then the great thing is you end up, even after all those people go with a happy feeling about evaluation, you end up with information and data that you can clean, you can code, and you can analyze. There's ways that you can find out, did it work? Did it not work? Where are the gaps? So that's the speed dating part of this presentation. So think about some of those things as Lori starts to demonstrate it. And then as we get to the end of the program, we'll have some time for question and answers. And you can always type in your questions and we can find a way to answer them later too. So I'm going to let Lori take it from here.
All right, thank you, Deborah. And I have to apologize if you hear some background noise. There is a very large building being constructed about 150 feet from my office window, and they seem to have just now ramped up the slamming and bashing of large pieces of metal. So if you hear something, that's what it is, and I apologize.
Lori, before you start, this is Heidi. We had one point of clarification. Deborah mentioned a website where we could access, I think, Mary Emery's article, and I think she meant the ERCC website, or is there another one as well?
We have a website where we've collected everything together, Lori's and my information, and plus others. So it's listed at the end of the webinar slide on our contact.
Great, and we can link to that through the ERCC as well. So thanks, Deborah.
Yep. There is a link to the article on the ERCC article that has been published. So there's several options and for you to get access to that information. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the interviews that you start your process with. And typically we'll pair people up. Sometimes people say, well, we have an odd number, so we need to have 3 in this group, or people will say, I think we need to have groups of 3. I really like to keep that flexible and allow the participants to drive that part of the process. So sometimes we end up with, 2 small groups or pairing people up. But in general, that's what we suggest, is pairing people up. Give them 15 to 20 minutes. These are 3 appreciative inquiry questions, and if you don't know what appreciative inquiry is, there's more information out there for you, and I highly recommend you learn about it. I love it almost as much as ripple effect mapping. But it's a positive approach to identifying what is working about a project or a program. And what we found is, rather than taking the usual needs assessment approach of what's not working, where what do we need that we don't have. If you focus on existing assets and existing projects or programs that are working, you are more likely to be able to build on those successes and move forward and make an effective plan for the future. So that's just a tip of the iceberg about appreciative inquiry. And these are just 3 examples of questions, and typically we'll have 3 to 5 questions that we form, and we build them for each unique situation, and we refer to the specific program. These are generic questions, but say for the Horizons program, which is where I've done a lot of the ripple mapping, I would refer to the Horizons program specifically, or the name that they gave themselves, to really make it personal and connect with the participants. I also like to tell people that these are just guiding questions, and that not to worry too much about getting all the way through the list of questions, but that these are just guiding questions that point them in the direction of the kind of information that we're going to be mapping at the end. So let's move to an example of a map. This is about 4 feet tall by 6 feet wide, and that's about the right amount of paper for a ripple mapping session, give or take. As you can see, the ripple mapping can get kind of messy, so it's important to write clearly, and probably a little more clearly than I did in this map, but also to use 1 color per ripple, so that people can follow what you're doing, and then also at the end better reflect on the map as a whole, because that map as a whole is really powerful for the participants, because it really shows exactly how much work they have accomplished together. So the ripple mapping part takes, about an hour, I would say, is what you should allot for actually doing the mapping part. So 15 to 20 minutes for the interviews, about an hour for this, and then you need some time for debrief and talking maybe about next steps with the group and what they want to do with the map, and even talking about social capitals or community capitals if that's relevant to your process. I do a round robin. We do it as a round robin, so you take your first pair of interviewers and you say, share one thing that you talked about. And oftentimes they will, the nice thing about pairing up is also that sometimes people don't want to toot their own horn. They feel like they're bragging, but somebody they're talking to about an experience they had or something they did, and they're doing this one-on-one, they're more likely to share that, and then that person can share what the good things that person did that they'd be less likely to share in a group context. So that's why pairing off is really important. We do the round robin, but at the same time we are flexible to allow other people in the group, other participants, to add to the story that they're telling. So, a big program is kind of like, an elephant, and the participants are like the blind men, where somebody's working on one part of the project and someone else is working on another part of the project, and the information sharing doesn't always happen, or people don't always remember to share great things that happen. So a lot of times, as you say, as people chime in and say, oh, but you know, I talked to somebody who participated in that, and they said this was what they got out of it. And the initial person telling the story may not have had that knowledge. So it's great to allow people to elaborate on the ripple. Just being mindful as a facilitator not to get too sidetracked on side stories, and then to bring it back and say, okay, we're going to go on to the next pair, and they can share a story, and we'll go from there. So you want to give time for people to share and add to stories, add to ripples, but you don't want to let that go on endlessly, because then you won't end up capturing everything that happened.
Lori, we have 2 points of clarification that I just want to pause for a second.
Okay.
One is, how do you get through 10 to 15 people's interviews in 15 to 20 minutes? Are they answering with each other or to the whole group? And I'll let you answer that and then ask a second one.
So there's 10 to 15 people, and they pair off for the interviews. So everybody's doing interviews simultaneously, and then they're taking notes on the 3 to 5 questions that we presented earlier. And then we come back, we do the round robin where the first pair shares a story, then the second pair. So you have like 5 pairs. If you had 10 people, you would have 5 interviews basically, if that makes sense. So then they come back, they share with the whole group, and the facilitator is up mapping this at the same time. Okay, got it. I see that. Is there another one, Heidi?
Yep. Is the round robin taking place before the mind mapping?
The round robin is simultaneous with the mind mapping. So as people are sharing stories, the facilitator or mapper is writing it up on the butcher paper.
Okay, thanks.
So ideally, you will have someone who is also sitting at the back of the room with a computer and a mind mapping software program. Deborah and I use XMind, which is free, or you can buy the pro version. There are a lot of mind mapping software, lots of mind mapping software out there. So finding the one that works best for you. And that's one reason I'm really happy that ripple mapping is taking off and different people are using it, and that, you know, we'll be doing more and more sharing of lessons learned, because if there's a better software program out there than XMind, I'd love to hear about it. So this next slide is not from XMind, but it gives you an idea of how XMind works. And so I'm just going to walk you through one of the ripples from this. I'm going to back up from this Ryrie Horizons program ripple map. So Community Leadership Development, or Ryrie Horizons, is the intervention. And one of the things that was shared in the round robin was youth learn to be leaders. So we write that up on the flip chart, and somebody's typing it into XMind. And I might prompt after that is shared, okay, so youth learn to be leaders. So what happened as a result of that? Okay, and then they might answer, well, they created a youth council. They wrote news articles for the community paper. They did a community cleanup or river cleanup or community service projects. So you're getting, you know, a little more detail, and you're continuing to branch out on your ripple map. So after they share those things, and you might get some more details about the youth council. Is it working with city council? How many news articles? What were the news articles about? What kind of service projects did they do? How many people were involved? Some details like that, if they have them, if there was a grant involved for any of that, how much was the grant for? So you might be getting those kinds of details as you go along, if they're available. But then at the end, it's important to say something like, so what's different in your community as a result of this? Or why is that important that these things happened? And in this case, the answer was, well, our youth feel more connected to our community. And if you can imagine, there can be a lot of ripples from that. If a child or a young person feels more connected to their community, maybe they're more likely to come back to the community to live after they go to college, something we find is really important in our rural communities. So that's just an example of how you might take one item that's shared in the round robin, like Youth Learn to Be Leaders, and how you might ask questions to ripple that out, and how different people in the group could participate in that. You know, when you say what's different in your community, maybe more people have insights or wisdom about what that has meant for the community and why it's important. Here is an example from Deborah's work in Northport, Washington, and the Horizons program, just as it was typed into XMind, and just gives you an idea of how different activities might be rippled out. And then when you go back to look at the maps, you can see where some things, like in this case, the farmer's market, there are a lot of ripples from that. There is a lot of energy and a lot of impact around that farmer's market project. And if you see it going, the ripples going out horizontally, even further out of the screen, then you know that that project continues to have impacts and ripples in the community, and that was a successful project. And you can tell that just really by looking at the map without even going into the detailed coding and analysis. So this is in part why it's such a great tool for communities to reflect, because it provides them that visual that they can see how much impact their work has had in the community.
Lori, we have a couple of other questions that I just want to capture before you move on, if that's okay. Okay. So the one, I think, was looking for a little more clarification on who conducts the interviews. I think what you said is that the participants are discussing those questions among themselves? Yes. Okay. So, and then, go ahead. You create the questions ahead of time that they're going to be using in their interviews, and then you would print them out in a format where they can take notes as they're talking with each other. And then that's what they'll use when they come back to report and do the mapping. We do the mapping on the butcher paper. Okay, great. And then a second one was related to wondering if we could share a link to XMind, and I said I'm sure we could get that. But a related question was, has anyone tried Microsoft Project for this type of work? I have that one on my computer, but haven't tried it yet. And another one, I'll just chime in, said that they actually use, like to use MindMaple for this kind of activity. Oh, wonderful. Thanks for sharing that. Not sure about Microsoft Project, but, and there is I think we do have a link to XMind on the website. Is that right, Deborah? Yeah, yes. If not, it will be there. Elena Lumby just shared it, so I have reposted it. And in the meantime, we had one more question. Is it important to differentiate between direct and indirect impacts?
Not during the ripple mapping itself. I think you get sidetracked if you try to point out those distinctions. People really enjoy the storytelling, and you don't want to really interrupt that with, imposing, more structure or maybe more academic details in the process. Later, that's when you identify the direct and indirect ripples, if that's important to you.
Okay, Lori, if I can keep you for one more minute, I just think that these are important relative to this section. So the question, is this all anecdotal information?
In anecdotal, it would be, I guess some of it would be, but it's like a qualitative interview that you would do in a qualitative research project. So as much as that is anecdotal, this is anecdotal, but it's really direct experiences that people have had with a program or project and knowledge they have. And we've alluded to doing follow-up interviews later. You can fact check. You can go back and check the accuracy of information. You can get more details on it by doing follow-up interviews, following up with perhaps people who are absent from the ripple mapping session. Anything to add, Deborah?
Yeah, one of the things I'll talk about later is the challenge of credit, who gets credit for all this work. And so I'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about limitations and suggestions.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so just a note on the Community Capitals Framework, because this is, a commonality among all the approaches to ripple effects mapping is that we all use the Community Capitals Framework. And there's information on the website link at the end of the webinar, a nice 1- to 2-page primer on it that if you're not really familiar with it, it will help you learn more about it. Also, I think that for that we all use it. It's important because it provides a common framework for understanding the impacts of our programs. So by using it to code and analyze our data, then when we go to write it up in a journal article or do a presentation at a conference, anything where we're sharing our work with colleagues, I think it's important that we have a common framework. So that's why I really think I like it that we're all using the Community Capitals Framework in relation to ripple effects mapping. Another note on data management strategies is that you can use in extension, we use the logic model a lot, where we talk about short, medium, and long-term impacts. And by short, we talk about what did people learn. By medium, we mean what did people do. And by long-term, we mean what changed. What kind of permanent or cultural or institutional change happened in the community. So using that can fit really well with the ripple effects mapping and reporting that out to decision makers, to your administrators, and even to communities. you know, to reiterate the point that Deborah made, helping communities track how those short-term impacts, those things they learned, the relationships that were built initially, how those led to greater impacts, gives them insights about, you know, what first steps for any future projects. That was one of the big ahas when we did ripple mapping with Horizons Group. One woman was a little disappointed when, you know, she walked in and we were talking informally, and she was talking about how she wished more had been done related to Main Street development and business development. By the end of the ripple mapping session, when there was this huge concentration of impacts related to relationships and people gaining knowledge and people acting more in concert as a community and as a group, she said, oh, okay, so far we've really laid a great foundation for doing the Main Street entrepreneurship work that we couldn't do without those relationships, without, you know, learning some new skills first. So it's important, again, I think, to include that when you're communicating with your communities and with your decision makers, because we don't always get credit for having those activities that really build relationships, that build that social capital, and it's hard to convey the importance of that. But I think ripple mapping is a really effective way to demonstrate that. And here's an example from our earlier example of how we might, using community capitals and the short, medium, and long-term coding schemes, how we might code the data that we shared in our example. I would point out, too, the created a youth council might also be political capital, because if the youth council is working with city council and they're having an impact, they now have a political voice, that's increased political capital. And here is an example of how that coding using community capitals and short, medium, long was downloaded or exported into an Excel spreadsheet. And just to point out that this is something you can't easily do with the free version of XMind, but the pro version, which isn't very expensive compared to a lot of things out there, allows you to do easily, as well as put it into all kinds of different formats and tag things and code things a little more easily. Okay, 17 minutes left. Okay. I'm turning this over for a quick review, turning it over to Deborah for a quick review of some of the limitations, some of the challenges maybe you might run into as you use ripple mapping, and some suggestions on how to address those challenges.
Thanks, Lori. Some of these challenges have already been identified, so I will go over them quickly. In all qualitative type of evaluations, you do have a risk of bias in participant selection. So depending on how complicated or how long your program is, you want to make sure that you get people that were involved at every phase or in every piece of the program. You'll also maybe want to invite observers of the program to what I would call truth test some of the information shared. You can also conduct follow-up interviews with people to find out if some of the information that's being shared is true. Oh, can you go back one?
Sorry.
No, it's okay. And then there's risk of bias in recording and reporting of these impacts. So like I said, we have lots of conversations at almost every group about sharing the credit. Because in these complicated and diverse groups, someone who's been involved, like Northport, in the community garden, maybe the woman who started the community garden wasn't involved in the project, and you do not want to take that credit away from her. But I have long conversations about, did you learn anything? Did you write a grant that helped support the community garden? We're not trying to say that this particular project did everything involved in the program. What we're trying to say is look at how many people were involved and look at the impact of those activities and the ripples of that. So it is a conversation I've had to have almost on every group, and if they don't bring it up, I do, because I don't want to be mapping stuff up on the wall that didn't actually happen here or wasn't part of this group. And like Lori said, if you use a third-party facilitator, that helps that because you don't have the person running the program coaxing them down a path that maybe they wouldn't go to. You want this to be their story, the participant's story about what they did in the program. So this does dance a fine line, but that's what we're trying to do is let them tell the story about how they feel about the program. If you are trying to combine programs and look at like large groups of data, so examples, we talked about our Horizon communities. We had 9 communities in Stevens County. I wanted to see, were the successful communities doing something different than the less successful communities? So for me, it was very important to use the same facilitator, the same recorder, and the same mapper so that the same energy is in the front of the room, the same level of detail is going into the map, and that we're consistently drawing in that information and putting it into the program. We also developed facilitator guide with prompts and probes so that we were asking the same questions of each community and making sure that we consistently gather that information together. None of that is important if you're only evaluating one program. You can decide the depth and level of facilitator and mapper that you want. If you want really good, strong data, my best mapping event, I had somebody writing it on the wall, a facilitator managing the group and prompting. I had someone typing it into the software. I had someone taking notes in longhand, and then afterwards, the data was very rich because we had the structure from the map, we had exact quotes from the writers, and we ended up with some really good information. So, another piece that's a limitation is the participants may not have all the complete information. What if you say, well, I know we wrote a grant, but I don't know how much it was for. Well, you can write on the map, received a grant, and then put a big question mark and circle it. That's a thing that you can follow up with an interview and talking to other participants. So gathering the stories is what's important on that mapping thing. The details you can always follow up. I mean, we got to the point where we were asking, were any jobs created, and then putting a big question mark and finding out how many jobs. Depending on what your design of the program is and what you're trying to track, you may have very specific things that you're looking for. How many youth were involved? How many seniors were involved? It just depends on your particular program. So sharing the data, the most simple thing to do is, like Lori did, is take a picture of everybody in front of the map. Once you put it into Xmind, you can print it as a large poster and give it to them. On the website, there's a link to the Minnesota Ripple Mapping site, and they've done a lot of great creative work about taking Ripple Mapping data and putting it into reports and information pieces. So I encourage you to look there at how they've used some of their data. Another limitation is it's difficult to balance the breadth and the depth of the mapping. And so having an experienced facilitator is very important because you want to gather all the stories, but you do not want to go down a rabbit trail for too long where it gets to information that's not interesting. And I don't even know how to exactly describe that, but you need to have a sense of when you need to move on to another story so that you can ripple that out too. And you might be able to gauge that as you're starting to work on the project with the group on what information are we trying to discern from this group and where do we need to change? You can always gather those details later and fill them in. I had one community, it was Northport, that for weeks after the ripple mapping, people were emailing me information and stories that they wanted to include. So you're going to start this kind of eye-opening experience for them, and they'll want to keep giving you information if it's important to them. So what we try to do is keep the three things you want in mind. So in our logic model for this, we wanted to know, what did the participants learn? What did they do with that knowledge, and how did things change? So as we're developing our prompting questions, and as we're mapping it on the wall, we're always trying to say, well, why did that matter? And what did you do with that? And how did you know that you learned things? And what was the demonstration of things that changed? So it's a facilitator's, challenge to draw that information out of the participants, because they want to tell you they built a community center. You want to know that the sheriff came in and said that it's changed the way that you behave in this town. So those are the stories that you want to draw out and encourage people to share. So we have a few minutes for questions. How about that? Are you sending them to us as you come in?
Yeah, we're all caught up on we are all caught up on the questions that have come in so far. So others, please feel free to chime in.
This is Lori. I'm going back to the slide just to point out that this group, it was their idea to have a picture of them taken with their map. They were so excited about this mapping process. They were a group that they had been feeling like, oh, we're floundering a little and we really didn't accomplish much. But then when we mapped it out on the butcher paper, they were just amazed. They were like, wow, we really did do a lot of work. And so they were so proud. They wanted to have a picture taken with it. And they were so excited by and energized by the process that we had to keep a parking lot flip chart paper of items that they needed to talk about at their next meeting, because they kept coming up with these great ideas as they were going through the mapping process.
I will also, I will just have one other comment. On one of our communities, they noticed that there had been doing so much work in their communities around preparing for disaster. They're very, very remote, and they have very limited communication avenues. And so as we got to the end of the map, they said, boy, it seems like we should be able to get some money from FEMA or USDA for community readiness. And then they say, look at all the work we've already done on it. So they start to see their successes up on a wall and start developing ways that they want to move forward with it. So it's a very energizing and exciting thing to watch people kind of learn from themselves about what they're doing right. I guess that's the way I describe ripple mapping.
Okay, so we do have a couple of additional questions. One was they thought there would be website resources for the tools at the end, and we do have that website coming up in the last slide. The next one is today's PowerPoint is available as well. We will be posting that along with the recording, and that may take a couple of days to get up, but it will be there, as well as the links that Deborah and Lori have mentioned. And then here's one for you, Deb and Lori. How long after a program project is done can you be successful in a mind mapping exercise?
Well, I'll start answering that. We did an exercise with some summer interns, WSU interns, and it was done at the very end of the summer after their internship. And it was very clear that the ripples they identified were all things that they learned, but not very many medium-term and or long-term outcomes. And so to us, it identified that we need to go back into that community and find out what some of the longer-term impacts are. But for that group, it was a great celebration of, look at all the stuff that we learned and that we did. And so you need to decide what kind of what depth of information and data you want to be able to report. In Northport, I went up in there 6 months after the event, and I went in 3 years after the event. And so there's a whole different experience depending on how long you wait.
Yeah, and actually we've both done that with some Horizons communities where we ripple mapped right at the end of the program and then went back a couple years later and ripple mapped again. So we're able to capture more of those long-term impacts going back later. So I think it's good to do it right away, because I think at the end of a program it's really helpful for people to reflect immediately on what they've done. But then I think going back again is just as important if you really want to capture all the medium and long-term impacts.
So I see a question here about how do you encourage people to participate for this, dedicating the time for this activity. And because I've had so much personal success with it, it's really easy for me to go into a group and really talk about the value for them to do this, not the value for me. I sell it as it's going to help you feel good about the work that you did and places that you want to go. And I never actually tell them that I get to walk away with a bunch of data. I don't tell them it's a, evaluation tool that I'm going to do something with. I say this is an end of project celebration. This is a way for us to find out what's working and what's not working. And it has not been difficult to get people in the room because you sell it that way instead of, oh, come on, let's get together and evaluate you.
And offering food helps.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, next question. You had mentioned a mid-process ripple mapping exercise. At what point do you determine the group needs to do this exercise, or do you plan it in advance?
Good question.
Yeah. The one I did clearly midterm, I got a sense, it's a hunger coalition that I'm working with food banks and summer food programs, and I got a sense that they were getting a little bit lost and distracted with their mission about what they were doing and where they were going. And so I said, well, let's get together and really look at the progress that you've made, because they were getting frustrated with things that weren't happening. So I used it as let's make sure we celebrate where we are and then go forward. So it was probably a year into the coalition that I could get a sense that they were floundering and a little bit of divisiveness because they were floundering, and I used it as a kind of a community building tool with the group to come back. So I didn't plan it ahead of time. I just used it as it was a conflict resolution tool, to be honest.
That's helpful. How did you learn to do this? Did you participate in doing one first off, or just jump in?
Well, Lori, we made it up, so we've been learning all the way. We're still learning. We've done training for Washington State Extension. We co-trained a group of people for Washington State Extension faculty. It was a 2-day training where we did all of this for a day that we just gave you in an hour. And then we actually spent the night and then ripple mapped the Master Gardener coordinators the next day so that they could learn to stand up in front of a room and do the facilitation with Lori and I coaching and helping them do that. So I used to say this tool was easy because I've been doing it for so long and I love it so much. After that training, they said you have to take that phrase out of the training because it's not easy unless you get to practice it. So that's how we learned. Lori and I have been doing it we've been teaching each other how to do it better, I guess is how to say it.
Deborah and Lori, I just want to do a time check. We have 2:59 and about 3 questions left for maybe. Are you okay staying on an extra few minutes if people want to stay on, or do you want to take those we had talked about if there were questions we didn't get to with such a large group that we could address those later via email?
Oh, let's go ahead and do them. I'm fine.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So have you done this with groups Extension was a key player in? Do you use a third party, not Extension, to ripple map these?
Well, my experience has been the Horizons Project is the example where we were the delivery organization of Horizons in the state of Idaho. But I was not involved, directly involved with the communities that we ripple mapped. So they had coaches, extension coaches, and then we had extension faculty who were kind of coordinating and supervising the program, and I didn't play either of those roles. So me coming in, they didn't know me, I was able to do the ripple mapping effectively, I think. So that's my experience.
Yeah, I think I could go in and do a ripple map for another group or organization within Extension, even our state, because it's a process that evolves from the stories of the people in the room. It would be difficult for the person running the project to do it alone. They could be there, but not to do it alone because of might be the guiding into a corner. But I'm just helping them get the stories up on the wall. The group kind of truth tests itself a lot. They'll say, no, that shouldn't go on that ripple. We should put it over here. And it becomes this, they work the wall. You're just helping facilitate it. So I don't think you need to have a complete outside person. When it comes to the coding of it, you'll want to make sure it's not just one person, or how you actually look at the data. That you need to be careful about the qualitative part, qualitative analysis.
Okay. Do you see benefit in audio recording the session, the sharing of stories for quotes?
I've never done that. And it's never occurred to me that that would be a good thing, but that doesn't mean there wouldn't be instances where it could be helpful.
I found when someone was actually handwriting the quotes, you could get the quotes very, very easily. I'm just speaking about my communities and the people that I work with. I think they would be uncomfortable having it audio taped, but they're fine with everybody taking notes. And the other thing I wanted to note with that question is, we're very careful about not putting people's names and personal information up on this map, mostly because we're trying to figure out what works in the community. We're not trying to single out and or point out anybody individually. So that's one thing that they're very more comfortable about, that it's our group project, it's not me up there on the wall. We have not audio tapes, but you could.
Okay.
Just make sure you write it into your IRB if you do.
So related to that, that was a good question. We just had one. Have you received IRB approval?
Yes. We received IRB approval for many. I have for 3 or 4 of these projects.
Okay. Are you using ripple effects mapping and mind mapping interchangeably, or is there an important distinction between the two?
Well, mind mapping has been around since the 70s. Tony Buzan wrote the book about it, and it's generally used for planning and note-taking and things like that. We've kind of figured, we have a sense that we're the first group of us that are using mind mapping for evaluation. There's concept mapping and some other things that people do for evaluation, but mind mapping is that drawing on the wall piece of ripple effects mapping. So to me, it's embedded in the process. It's not 2 separate tools.
Okay, so we've had a couple more come in if you guys are still okay.
Yep.
Is each round of the round robin pairs story sharing a new ripple?
Want to take that one, Lori?
Say that again.
So I think they're saying as you do each round of the round robin story sharing between pairs, is that a new ripple in the ripple mapping?
Typically, typically it will be a new ripple. You'll start a new ripple, but you know, sometimes, as Deborah pointed out, the participants will go, oh, that's really related to this other ripple that we started above that or already, you know, so they may, it may connect to an existing ripple, but typically it will be a new item. You might want to, depending on your project, I tried to encourage our Horizons groups to share information by first saying what team the project came out of, because all of our Horizons groups in Idaho formed action teams. So if they would say, oh, well, youth learn to be leaders, I would say, oh, what action team was that part of, or was it part of one? So when possible, I'm trying to provide a little bit of structure so that later when, you know, we go in to analyze the data, there's a little bit more organization, and we know, oh, well, all the communities that had communication teams did newsletters, and, you know, 9 times out of 10, those newsletters had lots of great impacts in the community. So it's helpful to provide a little bit of structure that way.
Okay, have you used story circles rather than interviews to create opportunity to gather information from larger groups? And if you haven't, could you imagine that tool working with ripple effects mapping?
I don't know that tool well enough to say.
Yeah.
I've just not used it.
I haven't, I don't think I have. Maybe I have and I called it something else, but.
Okay, one last question. How do you decide when do you move to a new ripple?
It's magic.
That's where the art comes in.
Yeah.
You know, and experience. And, you know, after you do ripple mapping one time, you know, evaluate your performance and go back and say, boy, I really went down a rabbit hole here. Or I think a rule of thumb is, you know, if it feels like the participants are just dredging and they're trying to pull out information out of their heads for you in answer to your question, and it's hard, you know, let it go. Move on to the next ripple. You don't want to start badgering people. Well, what about this and what about that? If they lose interest, you know, you're going to lose them. So keep the energy high and engaged, and use that as part of your way of gauging whether it's time to move on or not.
Well, and then also, like facilitation, you need to be careful of the people who consume all the airspace in the room and want to tell every little detail of their story forever. And so you need to be able to kind of talk about getting their information up there, but then moving on to another ripple. You don't want them to be the only star in the room. So it is a facilitation skill.
So I want to thank everybody. I want to point out that someone kindly noted that we missed the last number of Deborah's phone.
I see that. I just saw that. It's
so I just
2588.
Yes, so I just added it into the chat box.
Okay.
But Deborah and Lori, I want to thank you very, very much for this. You know, we had 160-some people register, and I think we had 111 on today. So it's great that there's such an interest, and we appreciate the leadership you guys are providing for moving us forward in this way. We will take the chat box. If there's any questions that we missed, we will try to get back to you by email. Deborah and Lori offered to do that. And I just want to remind everybody that at the end of this, you will be sent to a link to our 3-question evaluation. It's very brief, but your feedback is is important and appreciated. And then that'll also send you to our website on extension.org, so the Enhancing Rural Community Capacity, COP, link there, and under Virtual Learning Center is all of our webinars and links to related tools. We will be adding additional links to this section, to the section on ripple effects mapping in the coming week, and we'll be getting the PowerPoint and recording up by week's end. So check back soon, and thanks again to everybody for joining.